Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the Spencer family, Community Health System, Harris Ranch Resort, Producers Dairy, Valley Children's Healthcare, and The Wonderful Company. Additional support provided by from the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's public universities. This is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Blake Zanti.
Welcome to the Maddy Report. I'm Blake Zanti, Executive Director of the Maddy Institute and your host. Today we're talking about California's regulatory environment and the impact to California businesses. Joining us today is Robert Lapsley, President of the California Business Roundtable, a nonpartisan organization comprised of the senior executive leadership of the state's major companies, employing over 500,000 Californians. Mr. Lapsley has extensive experience. He served in the U.S. State Department as a special assistant to the U.S. Ambassador to Spain during the Iraq War. He was also Chief of Staff to California Secretary of State Bill Jones and served as an Undersecretary of State from 1995 to 2001. He is a graduate fellow of the Coro Foundation and a veteran of the U.S. Air Force. He holds a Bachelor of Science with a major in Biology and Political Science from Illinois State University. Rob, thanks for joining the Maddy Report today. Really appreciate you being on the show.
Well, it's my pleasure. When it comes to former Senator Maddy, it couldn't be more of an honor to be here with you today.
Well, I'm grateful that you're here. We have a lot of topics to discuss today, but maybe just to start off, Rob, for those who may not be familiar, can you just start by briefly telling us about your role with the California Business Roundtable and also maybe the mission of your organization?
So the Roundtable was first established in 1976 by some of the largest iconic companies in California at that point, Hewlett-Packard and many others. And we're an organization that represents CEOs and companies across all sectors of California's economy. And we exist to be able to work with the legislature and the federal government to be able to try and create a business climate that will grow jobs for all Californians throughout the state. And we do that by working on legislative policy. We work on the politics in the legislature. We work on the initiatives of California directly. We do that through litigation. So we have what we call a very large toolbox to be able to try and create positive change for California.
You know, when people hear the term business roundtable, you mentioned those large companies, but, oftentimes, advocating for, things that are good for business can sometimes and oftentimes be good for just the everyday Californian, the consumer as well. Talk a little bit about, maybe some of the things that and issues you focus on. We'll get into more specifics in a bit, but, some of the big issues that maybe impact everyday Californians that the Business Roundtable focuses on.
I think you have a very astute point, because the reality is that our members and our senior executives know that what's good for business is what's good for the average Californian. That is their market. And so their mission and their focus is to say, we got to do everything we can to help the average Californian so that we can then help California as a whole, which ultimately is good for business. And, with the change in the policies that we have seen in California, the number one focus of the roundtable right now is cost of living. Our cost of living continues to skyrocket from the different policies that the legislature is passing. And you see it play out particularly in housing, but our energy policies, our actual cost of energy, which, again, especially for the Central Valley, you bear the brunt of in the summer with air conditioning costs, food costs. Everywhere we turn, the cost of living continues to go up.
The state budget was also recently just passed. What are, just from a high-level point of view, what are some of the major maybe wins in that state budget, but also major concerns as we look ahead in California's future?
So the state budget, we're at an all-time high. So this budget that they just passed 2 weeks ago is $322 billion. So our revenues have continued to grow. That's the good news. So, as we came out of COVID, with Governor Newsom, our revenues have grown 5.5% on average every year. A lot of people think we've, gone backwards, or we have, a major deficit because we are losing revenues. That's not the case. Our economy continues. It's so robust. it continues to form. We have challenges, but that's the good news. Now, the challenging news is that the legislature and the governor spend at a rate of 8.5% a year. So based on their spending and against our 5.5% revenues, we have now developed a $10 to $15 billion structural deficit that's going to have to be addressed. If we have cuts from the federal government, that deficit's going to get bigger. Now, we've had a rainy day fund that we have been able to work with the legislature to establish. That helps kind of smooth out year to year. When you have money in the bank, like anybody's personal budget, you can smooth out a good month or a bad month by using your savings. The state's done that over the last couple years as this structural deficit has been built with their overspending. But we're getting ready now to run out of our savings. And so then the question is, what do we do? And right now, the state is facing choices of whether they raise taxes more when we're the highest tax state in the country, or whether or not they make actual cuts. This year, they made no cuts. They pulled money from the rainy day fund. They kind of papered things over. They moved expenses to some other accounts. And they have a lot of different ways that they can try and make things look balanced. But the reality is we have a major deficit. It's structural. It's going to continue to grow. And they're going to be faced probably next year with that fundamental decision, cuts or taxes. And I can tell you from a business standpoint, on behalf of the average Californian, we will fight and fight and fight before we're going to allow more taxes to be raised in this state.
Well, we'll dive into more issues in the future upcoming segments of the program. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back to the Maddy Report. Rob, thanks again for joining us on the program today. Let's talk a little bit about cost of living, something that you were just starting to discuss at the beginning of the show today. California continues to rank as one of the most expensive states in the nation to live. From your perspective, what are the biggest drivers of the high cost of living here in California?
The drivers are the policies that the legislature is passing. And what they do is they pass a law that says we want to reduce greenhouse gases to 1990 levels by 2035. And then they hand that off to an agency called the California Air Resources Board. That agency is responsible for implementing programs to achieve that goal. Now, two things that are critically important. When they establish those programs, one, it never goes back to the legislature to be reviewed. It just gets implemented. So there's no accountability in how far, how fast, how much that actually happens. And two, their primary mission is to achieve the goal set by the legislature. It's not to review the policies for how much they cost the average Californian. So as a result, we have all these regulatory policies on top of each other now that sound good, and we support many of these. But again, they're not being looked at for how much they're now costing, and there's no review to go back and say, maybe we need to adjust this and fix it so that we can accomplish the goal. Maybe it'll just take us longer, but at a much lower cost. So now we're at this crisis of affordability, of cost of living, and it's also now impacting, from a regulatory standpoint, our gasoline supply. Because of the regulations, we have 2 refineries that are closing in Northern California by early next year. We're going to reduce our gasoline supply by 20%. And as a result, with the regulations and those closures, gas prices are going to continue to go up.
Now, looking at the impact to, working class and middle class families, especially here in the Central Valley, those types of impacts are a big deal, particularly with the refinery closures and gas prices that you mentioned. What are some, potential solutions, or what are some policies that could be introduced to be able to help mitigate some of those effects on working class and middle class families?
We had this discussion again at my board meeting among the companies. It's like, our hearts break for what the average Californian is facing. We have jobs here, but in order to live here, you got to work 2 jobs or more. in now many of the communities in order to be able to afford the costs that are imposed on them, right? Again, through legislative policies. So some of the things that we believe need to happen, number one, there should just be a pause on these policies until we can get a handle on the economic impacts, especially for the average Californian, and just slow it all down. We're not changing things, so we're not trying to say we won't accomplish the goal. We're just saying slow it down. And that if we take a pause on some of this, that will allow the proper time for review and be able to potentially, if they would, make some changes. Number two, and this would be a law change, but once the regulatory agencies like the Air Resources Board implement a program, especially a new program, it absolutely has to go back to the legislature for review and approval to ensure that not only will it meet the goal, but it's going to protect their own constituents who they represent so that it's going to be affordable. And none of that exists. And if we could even do that, that would help, I think, bring some common sense to the implementation of these policies, not just keep passing one thing after another because they're supposed to do it. We need common sense back in this system.
Now we're going to take a quick break and then we'll touch on more topics in a second. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Rob, I want to talk a little bit about housing and development, something that the Business Roundtable also focuses on in its policy portfolio, among many other issues. Lack of housing is often cited as a major contributor to California's affordability crisis. Recently we saw the governor and other legislators who touted a piece of legislation that was led by Assemblymember Buffy Wicks out of Oakland that says that it enacts some CEQA reform specifically for infill housing development. Will this piece of legislation make a difference? Will it make an impact on California's housing affordability crisis? And is it enough?
So it's not enough, but I want to start by giving credit to Assemblywoman Wicks. She has been just devoted and dedicated and working tirelessly to try and fix now some of the laws around CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, that will allow more housing to be built. As we know, if we can build more housing, costs will come down. But as we also know, the more policies that we pass from the legislature on housing, the more it increases the cost. So what they passed recently is directly targeted to help build more infill housing. So that's in the cities, that's higher density. It does nothing to help build more suburban housing that families in California desperately want and desperately need. We're 3.5 million units short of the housing we need in California. Last year, we had a record number of low permits pulled in California for housing, a record year. So any other reforms that they talk about with housing haven't worked. This one should help for urban infill housing, but it does nothing for new communities that we desperately need and people in California want.
Now, another big issue that affects housing, insurance costs, and that's been a big topic lately, especially as it relates to wildfires here in California, which we've seen almost year-round now, unfortunately, and particularly in Los Angeles and other high-risk regions. What role should the business community play in wildfire recovery and resilience?
I mean, the company executives are so eager to be able to provide assistance because it's their rank and file employees who, right, have lost their homes, and they want to see recovery as quickly as possible, whether it's there or any other community, Santa Rosa, Paradise. And so, we have offered to help in so many different ways. But if we're talking about LA specifically right now, as we continue to spend, 6 months for that recovery process, yeah, there's been cleanup from the Army Corps of Engineers, but now we get to the real heart of it, which is allowing permits. And that process needs to be reformed, and the business community has offered to try and assist in the processes to do that. And so far, we're not getting a lot of positive reception.
When it comes to insurance, this is especially something that is on a lot of minds, especially in our rural communities, just up the hill, as we like to say, from places like Fresno and here in the Valley. We have a lot of communities that are, their only option for insurance is the California Fair Plan,
Yes.
Which is not the most affordable insurance option. Is this something that, the business community is monitoring, and how are some of these crises like wildfires influencing the cost of insurance in the state of California?
So the business community is directly engaged with the insurance commissioner to try and be able to help get this problem fixed. If there is no housing available, or if the cost of housing is too high, companies cannot attract the talent they need to want to either establish here, grow here, scale here. And I can tell you unequivocally that there are so many companies facing transfers or hirings where if it's outside California, they don't want to come here because they know they can't afford to buy a house. So on top of that then comes the insurance issue, because if you try and buy a house and maybe can afford to buy a house, can you afford to insure it? So the insurance, this is where there's actually some good news. Yes, over the past couple of years, obviously there's been a huge push to the FAIR Plan, but the insurance commissioner has started to implement some reforms that is going to be able to provide the necessary resources for the major insurance companies in California to start underwriting policies again. Specifically, when you look at State Farm, you look at Farmers. They have done everything possible to try and convince the insurance commissioner of what their risks are and then what they need to do to be able to make the market whole so they can write as many policies as possible. But if the insurance commissioner will not let them recoup costs, they can't take on additional risk or they go bankrupt, right? But I think we're finding now balance with the insurance commissioner, with Mr. Lara, who understands exactly kind of where things are, and he is now implementing some changes to be able to try and create balance in that system that will allow the insurers to start moving forward more aggressively to underwrite policies.
Thank you. We're going to take a quick break and then we'll be right back after this. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Rob, thanks again for joining us on the program today. Really appreciate your time. What are the top 2 or 3 policy changes that you believe would help spur significant job growth in California?
Job growth in California is right now in a very interesting time. So, we have not recovered the jobs that we have lost since COVID in the private sector. A lot of people don't realize that. And, our unemployment rate continues to be one of the highest in the country. And, we typically generate over 40% of our job growth through Silicon Valley, but they are now in a challenging time as their sector starts to change, especially with artificial intelligence or AI, and we're starting to see major layoffs in Silicon Valley. So then the question is, what do you do? And what's going to replace some of that? So, the legislature we have worked with to try and explain exactly what's happening in real time. We need policies that will continue to be able to grow, number one, logistics jobs, warehouse jobs in California. That is now our economic middle class job base in California. It's replaced all the manufacturing jobs that we've lost that have gone to Nevada and Arizona and other states because of our regulatory policies. Number 2, we need to lower litigation risk. We have certain employment policies in California, one of them called the Private Attorney General's Act, where employees can sue their employers over very minor little details, including just a mistake on their pay stub. We're the only state in the country that has some of these employment laws, and it has created so much litigation that employers are trying to figure out if they stay in business or go out of business when they get all these lawsuits. We need to further reform our employment practices, and especially around the litigation, that will create less risk for employers and more certainty that they will have revenues to be able to grow jobs.
Businesses leaving California, leaving the state, this is something that we see mixed feedback on. I think we've seen the Governor Newsom, sort of push back on that narrative and say that that's not necessarily happening. We see major headlines, that say there are big companies, leaving and relocating. From your perspective, is that trend actually true? Are we seeing businesses relocating out of the state? And if so, what's driving that? And if it is true, is there an opportunity to keep those businesses in California?
So unequivocally, it's true. Let me be crystal clear. We are losing companies. And it's not just the, like iconic companies or large companies that you may show up in the press. What we're losing is medium-sized companies who might employ 50 employees, right? Who are, again, the foundation of our economy. As we know, backbone is small businesses. But again, the risks and the costs associated for them to do business are astronomical compared to other states. So again, litigation costs, the employment rule costs, the taxes, relocation costs, you name it, and we're at the highest. Our energy costs, again, to just be able, if you have a small manufacturing facility, are you going to have natural gas in the future, or is natural gas going to be banned, which is what the state wants? So many uncertainties. And every day when, as I deal with different companies, the question is that I get, okay, we understand where things are today, with these laws and these costs, but what's next? So that question about what's next, it's a killer question, because nobody can answer that question. I can't answer that question, because with this legislature, right, we never know. And the governor, is sensitive to some of that, but the reality is he needs to be much more firm and be able to veto bills if they're bad, or tell the legislature we're not doing that. And so it's going to take both of them. And who the next governor is going to be absolutely critical to where, or how we keep some of these companies in California.
Well, time will certainly tell on who the next governor will be. We'll see what happens in 2026. Rob, I want to thank you for joining the Maddy Report.
It's my pleasure. It's an honor.
Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for tuning into the Maddy Report. To learn more about the Maddy Institute, visit maddyinstitute.org. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.com.